I'm absolutely thrilled to be here, really excited at the possibility of being able to have this conversation about art, race, and representation with this amazing, amazing group of people here, colleagues, friends, artists, thinkers. And so I'm going to start by introducing all of them, though their bios are in your program, so I will simply say by name, beginning with Nasira Gwyneth Sui-Lumas, she just gave me that, thank you. Thomas Lax, Kehinde Wiley, and Denita Zark. Thank you all for being here. We're going to begin with Nasira and Thomas first, who are going to sort of set the table to kind of open up this space of this conversation about art, race, and representation. But before, I am going to... I felt that the only way to really, for me, to enter into this conversation was to begin with this image by the artist Buford Delaney. Buford Delaney was an African-American artist born in 1901. His mother was born into slavery. This painting, made in 1970, is called Portrait of a Young Musician. Delaney was born in Knoxville, Tennessee, and left Knoxville, briefly went to Boston, but came to New York City in 1929. At that time, he became part not only of the active scene that was around the Art Students League and in the West Village, but became part of the salon that was created by Charles Alston in Harlem on 141st Street. He left New York in 1954 and went to Paris, where he spent the rest of his life until his death in 1978. And this work was made in 1970 when he was in Paris. And it really speaks to what Delaney is known for, this sort of portraiture which explores identity in the self through the picturing of people, but also his incredible engagement with sort of color. What was interesting to me about this picture, Delaney is an artist who came to me through the amazing and fantastic artist, writer, James Baldwin. And having been here for the last fantastic panel, I know that Baldwin sort of permeates for all of us. When I was a student studying art history and African American studies, trying to find a space in which I could understand what art and race and representation could be, Baldwin, who was my teacher in my second year of college, yes, he was. I never told you that, Tony? Wow. Yeah. Sorry. Conversation. We'll have that conversation later, but briefly to say, in 1985, James Baldwin said to me, with the aspiration that I gave to him of my desire to be a curator committed to artists of African descent, and he said Buford Delaney. Delaney was an artist who actually, in some ways, while he was a mentor to James Baldwin, giving James Baldwin a place in the West Village when he would leave Harlem and go visit him there, Baldwin went to France first, and Delaney came shortly after. They remained friends and colleagues, and Baldwin cared for him through the end of his life. And then when I said that, my desire, of course, to do what I wanted to do, Baldwin said the name to me, Buford Delaney. I'm thrilled that this painting, not there, that was there. Portrait of a Young Musician from 1970 is in the collection of the Studio Museum in Harlem, actually going on view in a week or so, along with other works from our collection. But also what's interesting about this painting is that all that I have come to understand about it anecdotally is that it was a painting that Delaney made as he did of people around him, and this young musician was a young musician of African descent, that is, a French African who was there in Paris that he painted. And with that, it also seems to me to bring us to where we are tonight, speaking of the way in which this idea of race and art and identity can live between this kind of cross-cultural conversation, both in the past as we've understood it as these looking between and at the cultures, but perhaps given the amazing panel we have here today, we can talk about it very much in the present, within the complexity that both was what Delaney experienced when he was in Paris making the paintings he made, but also that we know that the space of art is creating right now. So with that, Nasira, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you, Ta-Nehisi Coates, for inviting me not only to this incredible place, Albertine, but also to this special panel, to which I'm very much attached, because I think there is a lot that should be said about the relation between the US and France when it comes to race and art. I wanted first maybe to introduce the whole issue by saying that from my perspective as a sociologist and anthropologist, art is not just something that you appreciate, but something that speaks to the wider society and that has a purpose and a duty to unfold things that are usually just either covered or even worse than that, they are kind of put in the closet. And this is what I understand about race in France, and especially race relation to art in France. This is something that is not quite expressed and something that is often covered by the notion of high culture. And so I think it's important in order to understand how this unfolds today in France to have in mind that race is narrowly connected to two narratives or two genealogies. One has to do with the coloniality of today's France. And so this also traverses and kind of inhabits all the French art today, even if it's not often said. And the other dimension is that there is a way to look at art as a site of race through the long range of Orientalism that was central and is still central to the French way of dealing with art. I will not mention all the classical painting that we know that has to do with Orientalism. So Mabula, earlier in the other panel, was mentioning the fact that there are many proxies through which race is being worded or alluded to. So the painting I wanted to show has something to do with one of the proxies. So you will maybe be surprised to see that this is a painting showing white archers. It's a painting of a French Algerian artist called Hassan Smati, and it's part of a series that he made during a stay in Rome in 2015 and 2016. He was partly also welcomed by l'Académie Française there, which is La Villa Médicis. And during that, this one was painted after. And so the archers are interesting in the way that he tries to relate very deeply to something that has to do with classical painting, with the academic nude, as it was central to the French culture and to the French art scene. But what he tries to do is also to allude to something that you can hardly get to know unless you see the second picture that I'm going to show, which is the fact that the archer has a circumcision. And this is not random because circumcision is something that defines the other in the French culture because it is related either to Jews or to Muslims. And so the way that he reclaims the classical art also has to do with the fact that at some point he wants to show something that usually would not be there and is not there when you look at classical nudes, whether they are kind of referred to Greece or to ancient Rome. And so the circumcision is a way to reclaim something of that art and also to decenter this art and to reintroduce the other that he impersonates, but also that all kind of minorities do impersonate in France. So I think that's interesting to look at race, not just in terms of color, skin, but also in terms of how othering is being produced today in France and how this othering can be represented in the art through certain kind of different genres. And to finish with that, I just wanted to add something. I think that there is something very important today in French culture and French art that has to do with the way that when you become recognized as an artist, you face the risk of being whitened as a colored and racialized artist. So there is a political issue there once you are recognized in terms of what do you do with this recognition? How does it speak to other political issues such as structural racism, such as ordinary discriminations? And I think that's interesting to understand how this is how race plays out through art today in France. It's not just something that could be there in the painting or the piece of art. It's also something that enables and gives agency to larger groups that recognize themselves in the recognized artists coming from the colonies. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm thrilled to be here this evening with you all. Thank you to Ta-Nehisi and to Rima and to Thelma for the invitation. I think the moment that best encapsulates what it is for me to be here tonight is the moment when I told my mother, who's sitting here in the front row, who's a member of Albertine and also a very proud French citizen, that I was going to be here tonight. She told me, "You made it." So hopefully. So I would like to talk about an image by the artist Lyle Ashton Harris. Lyle is an artist who's based here in New York. He's an artist with whom I had an opportunity to work in 2011 when I was a curator receiving my PhD in Thelma Golden Studies at the Studio Museum in Harlem. And this image, I think in many ways speaks to the kind of bifurcation of time, the then and the now, that Thelma alluded to at the very beginning of tonight's panel. It's an image that was taken in 1992, as you can see from the lower right-hand corner from, remember when we used to actually print photos and they would have those little red numbers? So it's from 1992, when Lyle was going back and forth between London, New York, and Los Angeles. And the three folks that are depicted are the artist Sonia Boyce on the left, the cultural theorist Stuart Hall in the middle, and Isaac Julian, the artist and filmmaker, on the right. And this image, although it was made first in 1992, it wasn't turned into an artwork until just this year, when Lyle included it in his Ektachrome archive, which is currently on view in the Sao Paulo Biennale, and it will actually be part of a book that comes out next year, published by Aperture. So the reason I bring this image to the table is to think about what looking at Stuart Hall in this moment of repose, of comfort, speaking to two friends, but also to two individuals who are deeply influenced by his work, might tell us about the conversation around representation that we're having tonight. For those of you for whom Stuart Hall is a new figure, he passed away recently in 2014, and is deeply important to this conversation, not only because of the way in which he effectively founded cultural studies in Birmingham in the UK, and because of the way that he built a real political sense of solidarity between white working class people in the UK, Jews, and the descendants of people coming to the UK from the Caribbean and South Asia, but also because of the way in which institution building was at the center of what his life was about. He curated an exhibition as early as the 1960s, looking at kind of popular art and its role in influencing modernity. He was quite critical of the ways in which modern art institutions had excluded certain regions of the world, but actually wanted that acknowledgement to be front and center, as opposed to kind of being amended and annotated as a kind of afterthought. And perhaps most fundamentally, he was essential to the founding of Innova, a space in London that he was the chair of the board of directors of. And I think that in looking at this image, what you see is a few tensions. I think you see the importance of genealogy, of trying to make a history where one might not already find one through institutions, but you also see the way in which intimacy, friendship, camaraderie, touch are as important as this kind of role of institution building. I think similarly, here he's a kind of father figure in a way, but one who, rather than the kind of typical father figure who, is kind of represented as looking out and kind of representing the family, here is pictured, looking in and building a relationship to his kind of proverbial children. And I think finally what you see is somebody who, although he's no longer alive and no longer with us, continues to animate our present. And so there's a kind of bridge between the past and the present that in many ways becomes a kind of prompt for what the field of possibility might be in the future. So with those opening remarks as kind of some signposts to think through, I just want to say thank you for having me this evening.
So, thank you all. Thank you, Rima. Thank you, Thelma. Thank you, Tanahasi. This is an extraordinary night, extraordinary time to be thinking about France and to be thinking about empire, not the show, but rather the.
That's you.
Right. But rather the sense in which any artist like myself immediately wants to deal with all of those people who came before. How do we, especially as a painter, someone who's concerned with portraiture, how do you deal with the big boys? And if you're talking about the sweet spot for art, and particularly portraiture, France is it. To go to the Louvre, to stare at the Davids, to look at the Ingres, to really come in close and to know that level of mastery is to be in the presence of grace. But that grace came at a cost. That grace is the byproduct of people going out into the world deciding on purpose to annex, to consume, to bring back, and then to build these grand spaces in which we celebrate things that we all here love, contemporary art. What I'd like to talk a little bit about tonight is my conflicted relationship with Western easel painting. The sense in which, from the age of 9 on into right now, I've had this love affair with how to make things, colored paste, hairy stick, how to coax things into being, like those big boys did. And it started off in a very rude way. It started off visiting museums and looking at the great French paintings, but it also started off from the psychological space that's laid bare in paintings, the seductions that artists have for centuries engaged in. Art, of course, being the field in which they can function as the voices for the church first, the state, later wealthy collectors, later the artists voice themselves, but always having a little bit of tissue, this binding tissue that surrounds who we are as a people. There's this Frenchness about French art. And so the question constantly is, where do we draw the line? What is it about francophonie in language and literature, in the desire to see the essence of French painting, whether it be some of the Orientalist work that I love to my bones but cringe at, some of the amazing works that decide to look at the material practice of painting in relationship to light and the fracture, or the sense in which we are now a new investigation of the 21st century in France. My father's Nigerian. I have a home in France. Two different conversations. The artists that I speak to in Nigeria feel as though the colonial response was much more, stay in your place. Whereas the artists that I speak to, coming out of much more francophone traditions, felt like one day they were told that they too could be French if they just get their right. And so, as a contemporary artist, the question is, how do you respond to this constantly changing notion of Americanness, Africanness, African-Americanness? And tonight is a great opportunity to engage all of that. Thank you guys so much for allowing me to be part of that conversation. Yeah. While I was talking, this is just a quick background on what I do. For those of you, my work starts in the Black American street. I'm born in South Central Los Angeles to an American mother and an African father. I start wanting to create portraits about how culture evolves here in the Black American street, starting in Harlem. I fast forward into places outside of the boundaries of America. So my work is, sure, it's about American Blackness, but it's also about the anxiety at its borders. How do we define it? And what are America's relationships to its neighbors? Here it's Naomi and her daughters, shot in Jamaica in 2013. All complete strangers coming from the streets of Kingston. And I engaged them in a conversation about the history of all of those people who came through Jamaica as a colonial project. The Portuguese, the Spanish, the British. Each pose that they're taking on is actually the pose from one of the grand masterpieces from each of those colonial spaces. Here, dealing with Hans Memling, the Emperor Nero. Again, this is a portrait of a young African-American individual, but taking on the pose from Hans Memling's cabinets, these little wonderful cabinets that open up and give you a sense of the sacred, but in domestic spaces. Very petite, small little things where you contemplatively have to sort of paint in your lap. The touch is very different. From An Economy of Grace, looking at female beauty in painting, but pushing it beyond its sort of staid, drawing the eye across the nude body, resisting the face, resisting the male gaze, staring off into this field of the irrational, this field of the uncontrollable, the feminine, perhaps the brown or black or bound. Thank you.
Then, thank you to invite me here tonight. I'm sorry I don't speak so well English that I will apologize if you don't understand completely what I say. Then, because I'm not able to say it directly, I would like to read a little text that I wrote this afternoon to express who I am and which art I'm doing. As soon as I discovered that I was gay, when I was a child, I knew immediately that I would be different from the others. The different, the difficulty helped me to be who I am. It opened my heart and my spirit to the others. It confirmed also a conviction that I would be an artist. And since I was able to express myself in photography and video, I became interested in minorities. First, of course, by my own minority. But I'll expand my purpose to social and ethnical minorities, and also physical and mental disabled people. To express it, I built my image almost always in the same way. I try to mix two realities in the same frame. A person uses body language, especially in photography when you don't talk, to express himself. She or he take position literally and figuratively in the frame. I ask them to try to find a balance, a metaphorical way to express the difficulties to find a place in the society. All minorities have the same problem, a lack of visibility. Unless we don't work on it, I could say if we are not activists on this question, things will not change. Then I would like to show you the first image in a few minutes. This series was made 10 years ago. It's called La Chute. It's called The Fall. I made these images just after the riot in France. At that moment, two little boys who were escaping from the police get electrolyzed in the...
They were electrocuted in an electric transformer.
At that moment, immediately, all the suburbs of France, because in France, the poor are in the suburbs, all the suburbs of France, they decide to make a riot. They burn cars, they fight the police, from north to south to west to east. And when you were reading the media at that time, you thought that those guys, they were not able to make any sense of work, any capacity of concentration, any sense of effort, neither discipline. And because I was working with some of them in a city called Bobigny, I recognized that it was exactly the opposite. They knew how to express themselves. They knew that there was a possibility for them to be concentrate and to produce sign, to produce think. Then I asked them to, because they are strong in their own way to talk, I asked them to pose in front of their house and to express this difficulty to find a balance in the frame as in a jump. Because when you jump like this, you don't know if you're falling and if you want to escape the reality of your life. Then this is the first work I done. And after that, I made a second purpose. It's called hyper. The Hyper series is more about, it's Hyper, it's the name of the supermarket in France. You say you go to the Hyper, yes, blah, blah, blah. And this is probably the only place where to go when you're young and you're living in the suburbs. This is the only place where you can meet the other, you can see your friends, and you can have a talk and so on. But also, there's a place of so many goods, and probably for those guys and those girls, they don't have enough money to buy what they can have. And at the same moment, there was a political man in France who said that if at 50 years old you don't have a Rolex, you waste your life. Then I thought that this idea, this slow movement between being to having, was a very important mark of our society. At that time also, the president of France, his first movement, his first political action, it was to make jet ski around the yacht of a billionaire. And this is it. Then it means that he succeeded. He succeeded to do something. He's successful. He's a president. Now he can go with the rich. Okay. Then the next series called ACT. ACT is this only English word we can express 3 actions that I want to show in this work. It's a photography with disabled persons. And for me, ACT is action, because at the moment you decide to move your body, you decide to go somewhere, you're not a victim. And after that also, actor, because actor is the fact that you're not only what you are, but you can play with it. It's a way that you can suddenly do something else. That's what the nature or what the lifestyle, what you have to do or what you have to be. And I don't know if I'm clear enough, but. And also activism, because what I said before, if those people also don't have any image, they don't exist. And I thought that for me it was important that they have to be in the museum, in the art gallery, and not in the backyard of the hospital behind the cafeteria. And okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you all. I think that an interesting place to start is this idea of race and representation, right? Because art takes on the fundamental ideas and ideals of representation, but the space of race, right, exists within many constructs that we can understand culturally and politically. Kehinde, you took on sort of the big question of sort of grappling with the history of art, right? And the understanding of art and where you as an artist sit within that. Can you speak about what this idea of representation means for you in your work or in artwork generally as it relates to race specifically?
That's easily one of the best questions I've ever heard in my life, because I'm oftentimes dealt with having to nibble at the edges, and you've just gone directly to it. The point is that we grow up in these black and brown bodies, yet we receive all of these images surrounding what these black and brown bodies are composed and comprised of. And oftentimes there's this cognitive and visceral disconnect between what we know and what we're consuming. My work lives at that state of anxiety, that fulcrum point between what I know to be true and what I'm constantly navigating in the actual world. Representation is exactly that, a representing of the world. At its best, what we do as artists is we go into the world and we try to make sense out of this oftentimes gloomy and short and miserable existence. We oftentimes will try to find little aspects of it and zoom in. We can amplify aspects. We can create something out of the mundane. We can minimize the spectacular. But artists at their best, their goal is to look at what has been represented and to represent. So it's this doubling, it's this double speak that's going on. And if you throw race into it and the performance of race and the performance of self, it's not only who am I, but how people see me. So can we talk about a hall of mirrors? we're talking about easily one of the tightest ropes to walk. But it's strangely one of the most gratifying experiences because it's so imbued with confusion and so imbued with possibilities of fulfillment, because you realize that the real grace and the real humanity is something that you know in your bones. And you know that dance is something that has yet to be seen, well, for me, in certain aspects of the culture. And so to be able to have the privilege and the opportunity to try to thread the needle of all of these different halls, these different mirrors, is a really great one. But I can't give you a really strong material sense of race. I think it has much more to do with the poetics of how an artist interfaces with his practice, his history, and all of the received stories surrounding who he or she is in the world, and that becomes the work that's then beheld.
Thank you. Excuse me. So with that, Nusira, if we're talking about the idea that race does not exist in France, does art, visual art, have a place in creating the space of an understanding of race?
This is precisely one of the major challenges that today's France and today's art scene is facing. For that purpose, maybe I would draw on what you just mentioned and think in terms of a surface of projection, understood as not just art pieces, but also the artists that are being viewed in such ways that either they are completely, as I said, whitened, which means that there's some sort of a colorblind gaze that is projected onto them, and that would lead to the fact that nobody's supposed to consider whether they are white, black, Arab, or from any kind of ethnicity. And this is something that is very central to the way art is conceived in France. It is, if you ever think of the highest level of universalism that you can reach in the French culture, then you have to think in terms of art and literature. And those two arts are supposed to precisely be the site that allows for the erasure of race. And we are living in today's France the experience of becoming a multicultural society in which race not only is present, but was present all the time. It was always already present. It's just that we have a hard time trying to come to terms with what it means that race is so deeply entrenched, not only in the representation that France has of itself, and the mere fact that France views itself as white is part of the race experience. And so being white is also something that has to do with race and the way it is being framed by erasing the universal gaze that is projected onto racialized minorities and racialized bodies. So it's really interesting to look into today, how are we as a society and as people that try to encounter one another, how it is that today the issue of race can be addressed through art in such ways that it is not about reaching some sort of universal stage or level, but rather to acknowledge individual and singular experiences of being racialized as something that can be represented, presented again, presented anew through different kind of genres and different art stages, not just visual art, but also as we were mentioning, I think literature is also a space where this can be done. So this is something that is a real challenge that is not really addressed so far in the French society. I think that art is more viewed as a way to exfiltrate racialized individuals through their art to a higher level and to some sort of recognition. But I think it's also interesting to think in different terms. I mean, Do you produce art for your people, for the people that, like you, experience racialization, or is it all about becoming white?
Well, with that, Denis, I would love to know that in your project, in thinking about, as you sort of define the journey to your work, in picking subjects that are people of color in France, are you imagining that as not only about the specific themes that are inherent in each of your photographic series, but also about the way in which that impacts the sort of understanding of the history of art by making subject out of people of color?
I need some help.
Yes.
Representing people who don't have the voice. This is the idea of my purpose. But I never thought about race. I mostly thought about social meanings. I'm more thinking about people who are rejected from the society than more than the race. After that, the representation, the way I make my image, I show you only 3 images here, but it's really inspired by the paintings. Some of photography from art is completely inspired by the Manierism period paintings. And suddenly, because in Manierism period painting, people, they can be represented with a deformation. The body could be a little bit un peu plus tourné, retourné, twisted, and so on. And suddenly, with people who have disabilities, physical disabilities, when you represent them in front, because some image are made in front of the museum, in the museum, suddenly they was related, and they had a common physical issue. And it was for me important also that what we consider as a problem could it be seen as a quality in different paintings. Then I like to switch this paradoxical situation. And I used to think that I prefer to share. I mean, on the first image of my book, there's a man who have a pain in his back, and he cannot standing up. Then his body is like this. And at the moment, we decide together to say, we're going to show it. And because if we show it, maybe if a choreographer find this image, maybe he could be inspired by this movement, not to reject it, but to enlarge our vocabulary of form to express our humanity.
Thank you. So Thomas, to come to this moment, given your work as a curator, which has looked deeply at the sort of space of the conversation around artists of African descent, right? Locally, nationally, and internationally, in so many ways. Do you feel that there's the potential for something that feels like the multiculturalism, right? In some ways authored by Stuart Hall, who you brought beautifully into this conversation, can exist now to create some of what Nisira is speaking of, that creates an identity that understands race through art in contemporary artists in France right now?
I would say yes, totally and absolutely. I mean, I think, at least in this country, we're at a complete turning point in terms of the way in which institutions are facing this question. I think, there's a way in which some of the lessons that you've brought up in terms of the kind of French tradition can be brought to bear, specifically around the kind of counter to representation. I mean, I think, I realize there's something, contrarian to come into Albertine and to show an image of Stuart Hall, coming out of a very different kind of tradition than the French tradition. But I think that within that kind of shadow archive, there's actually a really important way to get to these questions of representation. I'll give an example from, a French-speaking person, Edouard Glissant, the theorist and poet and writer from Martinique, who spoke about the the right to opacity, the droit à l'opacité. So, what does it mean to, instead of thinking about what's legible or visible or can be seen, to actually think about the other side of that coin? And I immediately, when I think about that idea, go to James Baldwin and the fantastic paintings that Glenn Ligon made for one of the first shows that you made when you got to the Studio Museum, The Stranger in the Village. Because what's so amazing about that work, where he takes segments from that incredible essay by Baldwin of describing what it means to be totally marked by his skin color, is that you actually can't see or read fully what he says. And so I think that in that space of illegibility, of opacity, of unknowability, that's in many ways where the kind of crux of this conversation can exist, as much as it is also about being able to claim space decidedly, exclamatorily, and affirmatively.
But can the history of art sort of open up to this, right? I mean, certainly we can talk about this in an American context, and we see where that opening has been one that's been a conversation, right? A conversation that has been born out of a conflict of sort of understanding not just object but subject, right? Not just idea but maker. And really allowing Black artists to fully inhabit the space of art through content and form, right, at the same time, right? So is there a way that, you're a sociologist, so some of this also is really, we're talking about culture, right, in the largest way, that, can we imagine that there's a way in which the shift in identity can come quite literally through an engagement with the visual as created by artists?
Yeah, I think it's precisely being in cultures that are, as a French author would say, la société du spectacle. I mean, this is something that has become completely integral to the way we consider the world and we consider the place that we have in this world. So it means that this is something that should be available for anyone to do. And becoming a subject would also mean not just to be the object of representation, but becoming able to embrace expression of subjectivity through art. And this is also something that is interesting about the French case, is that art seems to be divided between the high culture that is mainly mainstream, white, with a deep, long, and rich history of being central to what the world considers to be art in general. And you would have kind of minor expressions that would be the ones that would be dedicated to the expression of the poor neighborhoods, of the racialized minorities. And this kind of minor art is not funded in the same way and is not viewed in the same way. So the whole issue is about escaping as a subject from this kind of space in which they are contained, in order to be able to embrace all kind of expressions of their own subjectivity, and not have just to make or prove now and again that they're able to understand what art is all about, as if it was something that is kind of crucial to being French, for example, as if, being French is about understanding what art is about, and not so much about being able to express through these kind of mediums.
Ginde, I have to ask you this question. I'm sitting here and I see you. Talk about the reception of your work in France. I mean, clearly your project sort of began here, began in the US, began with this idea of the looking that happened for you as a small child, right? In LA, in the Huntington and LA County, seeing works of art and beginning to project into them. But what has happened when you have shown your work in France with the full understanding of your project to sort of claim that history, but then also to make it your own?
Sure. I think it goes back to what you were... Sorry. Forgot where I was. It was that engaging. But what I came away with from the last statement surrounding difference in France had to do ultimately with what do we do with the question of assimilation. what does it mean to be French? What does it mean to be an artist in the 21st century redefining a relationship with the history of France? And then you throw me into the picture in the 21st century in France. That, I think, it's a really difficult thing to answer. By and large, most people who interface with my work want to know if they are first Americans in the pictures or Africans in the pictures. The way that I'm treated in France is decidedly different at Hôtel Coste if I am perceived as an American of African descent or an African in France. And I think part of that has to do with the false set of assumptions that we have about the intellectual capacity of Africans in America versus Africans in Africa, but also the redeeming capacity perceived by many of America's magic touch on black bodies. It's almost as though we somehow have transformed into simply objects to be consumed into objects of spectacle, where the relationship can go in much more circular direction. I'm not trying to have that, and I think that much of my frustration is the fact that I am both. I grew up in South Central, and I go visit my father in the villages of both Akwa Ibom and Cross River State in Nigeria. What gives anyone the right to kill my joy, to clip my wings, to tell me that my state of being is only within this one strict prescribed area, but also the ways in which I can consume, reimagine, dignify, or spit on notions of representation, notions of gender and sexuality and personhood. All that stuff is up to debate, as much as this simple, ridiculous, thin conversation about skin and its inflection. For me, and I think for most of us up here, perhaps even in this room, I just get so tired of such a thin conversation, this racial thing, because we contain multitudes. And when I look at the work of Glenn Ligon, and I read the work of Ta-Nehisi Coates and James Baldwin, it's for a moment where we can start to sort of go into this place of the irrational. And there's something about art that we all love, whether it be black boys' art or white boys' art or what have you. You don't know what's going to come next. It's this place where it throws you off of your assumptions about the past. You're in this new state that's not quite dream state, it's not quite irrational state, but it's definitely an engagement with the received knowledge and a potential for a new utterance. And I think that's called soul. And some people have it, and some people don't. But I don't think it's about race.
Denis, is there any relationship in your work and the project that your work's involved with that looks at American photographic representation and the way in which the photographic here does speak to these issues of representation? Is there any inspiration from American photography that informed the project that you're involved in?
I look at the photography for sure, but I will never take something else from one author. For sure, when I began to do some image with learning disability persons, I cannot avoid the fact that Diane Arbus made a last picture on that subject. And I said, how, 60 years later, can I do something about this subject? And how does it change the point of view? And probably the society changed completely. At that time, probably, this is my thought, she was limited in this society, in this white American society, and she wanted to escape and trying to find in the freaks and the difference of the society a way to express son mal de vivre, this difficulty to live in this life. 60 years later, it's completely different. For me, it's not what is far from me which is interesting me, but more what is close to me. Then this is the opposite point of view. That's it, if I can say something. But it's not an artist that I love or that it's very impressing me. I love it, but I love so many other artists, and not only photographer, specifically paintings. I love very much paintings also, and it's inspired me a lot. Can be also abstract painting. Then it's difficult to say where is it influencing me. I love art, as you said, and this is, I get feed the food from art, that's it, generally.
Thomas, you began with Stuart Hall, but when we talk about the space of a kind of post-conceptual practice by Black artists in this country, Frantz Fanon is critically important. Where do you see that in thinking about the contemporary art being made by artists of African descent in France right now?
Putting me on the spot, that's a no. I think specifically in terms of the space of the psyche, thinking about the way in which Fanon articulated, the way that the colonial project not only operates in physical space, but also operates through the interior as a kind of key way that, we were saying earlier that, 3 of the 4 folks who were nominated this past year for the Duchamp Award are folks who come, from the continent of Africa. And I think in many ways, their work is not touched by the question of race through solely visual terms in the way that you were suggesting, but also through, the kind of psychic influence of history and the ways in which those become kind of ties that bond us together. So yeah, I think that, that dimension of it, that kind of layering or the kind of depth of interiority becomes a way to think through Fanon's legacy in our time and in our moment.
What I find very interesting in the way Fanon has become more and more central to the French contemporary thought is the fact that he reintroduces the whole notion of a questioning humanity, and not just humanity that is already arrogant and sure of its future and its past. So I think this is also something that speaks very much to what can become the French art scene, a site of questioning as much as a site of representation in such ways that certain bodies that so far didn't find any expression could become more central to today's France, leaving the comfort zone, which is something that he did in all his writing. This is also something that could be a perspective for the contemporary art in terms of facing and expressing issues of race.
And then a question for all of you before we open it up to this kind of amazing audience for questions. But in an ever increasingly and perhaps effective global and international art world, do we need a national identity for an understanding of art? And if the answer is yes or no, what does that idea of a continuing sense of national identity mean when we are talking about multicultural societies?
I don't know, but if you say that there's a way to see the world and more like Francophonie than French, probably it's not a question of nation, but it's a question of the way, which language you use to express yourself. And for me, it's not such a shame to, to, to use the word of French thinking, or American thinking, or German thinking. And for me, it helps to me to understand the world by the way where you talk, from where do you talk. And this is, for me, it's been something. For sure. And specifically the artists, we are the winners of the globalization because we're here and there and we come back and we can go. And the people we met in the countryside in France, they're probably, well, they are lost, probably, of this new world. Then how can we help them to understand what's going on? And we see for this election in America, it's the same, probably the same in Europe, in the French election. Populists growing up because they are lost and they don't know where they can find identity. Probably it's a question that we have to figure out also.
You asked such a sweeping question. I know that there were several nodes in there, and I wanted to come back to all of them. The first one that stuck out to me had to do actually with Fanon, and specifically his import to modern life, both in France and globally. I think it's easy to forget that Fanon was working hand to hand with mental illness. He was working hand to hand with the fact that some people will drive you crazy. And he was dealing with all of the questions surrounding what is driving these people crazy. How are they losing their senses of self? And these are young people of his own generation, people who are slowly slipping away into this sense of despair, not because of mental affect or disease, but because of a system that gives rise to a sense of displacement, to go back to this sense of the ground that you stand on, both physically sometimes and mentally sometimes. So we pivot to the physical importance of borders. Is that something that really has currency in the 21st century? I've been asked about this with regards to my own sexuality. What does it feel like to be a queer American as opposed to a queer yada? This question exists in terms of the aesthetics, whether or not a type of painter coming from this part of the world can only function powerfully in certain languages and so on. I think it comes back to Fanon. I think it comes back to dealing with the world hands-on, and dealing with people hands-on, and dealing with lived experiences. We can't go into this very popular conversation right now about the promise of the virtual, the promise that somehow society and our higher selves will be arrived at by virtue of a device. Twitter's in Twitter right now. Some of the people vying for our highest office have, 3 in the morning, used some of our best tools to come up with our least, the least of us. I think going back to the physical aspect of not just painting, but of storytelling. Who are you? Who are your people? Welcoming people into our borders and saying, we care as much about you as we do about ourselves. It sounds very flat-footed, but in the end, what you're dealing with is something that's able to infuse not a conceptual notion of openness and borderlessness, but that thing that we have when your mama comes from this part of the family and so-and-so is Mexican and so-and-so, but we all sit down and we have, Vietnamese spring rolls because Aunt so-and-so was, and we really are part of an essential state of grace that has nothing to do with borders and everything to do with the essence of this family, whether it be aesthetically or literarily or so on.
I would say, Thelma, that you're asking, the essential question of our time. This is a moment where we live in the kind of a heightened moment of nationalism in this country certainly, but also in France with the rise of Marine Le Pen, and as we know, throughout not only Western Europe, but also Eastern Europe, Russia, South Asia, etc. And so I think the kind of resurgence of national identity in art, culture, and elsewhere is deeply troubling, but also something that elite institutions and art institutions have not fully dealt with. And I think that being able to imagine a kind of belonging that is still specific to place in the way that the Studio Museum, thanks to the fact that, Black nationalism never worked out, still has an ability to think about collectivity outside of the nation state, can put forward as an option. But I think that also is sensitive to the ways in which the folks who are most attracted to nationalist ideologies have felt left out by elite art institutions. And so I think holding that tension is deeply important, and being specific to the context that we find ourselves in. And so somebody like Rousseau, who in the 18th century was in that moment also critical of the ways in which Enlightenment thinking privileged elites at the expense of people like himself who are outsiders become ways to think through one genealogy in a given time and place.
I would want to finish with an optimistic note, and maybe because of what's happening in the US and will probably happen next spring in France. I have the feeling that we have a lot to learn from those that precisely were incarcerated in race and that have managed to escape this incarceration, most of them, by becoming transnational, by ignoring borders, by transforming them in porous spaces that they can circulate across. And I think that this is something, it's an art de vivre, it's a way of transforming life in art by being able to just move beyond this kind of obsessive rhetoric of national identity that we have experienced so far, not just in France, but across Europe and the United States. So maybe art lies precisely in those lives that are able to go across borders and to express a sense of belonging that is much larger than the world and maybe sometimes leaders of the world that we know too well.
Thank you. The question was meant to be optimistic, right? Because I really... because I wanted to speak to what I think is the fundamental power of art, right? And I think that we all live within a context of believing in art's power. And it seems that there are ways in which we have seen through history, right? But then in our own specific situations where the power of art has also been an important agent in the larger conversations about culture, right? The object itself speaks. The object has power. The object also becomes the record, right, of what the complexity and how it worked out. So that was the base of the question. Speaking of questions, I would like to open it to questions. There is a microphone, and someone who has a microphone. Oh, yes, okay. So I will point to, right, there's a question down here. She's coming to you, yes. And I'm going to ask that everyone ask a question. That means that at the end of it, it should lead us to the possibility that there would be an answer.
Yes, that's my question. All right, it's on. So very quickly, obviously, so we've been talking about race and representation. Necessarily, we're talking about racism and other marginalizations and representation, so creation in a context of duress. And so I'm wanting to push or to query for the two artists here, where in the inception and the conceptualization of producing art do you start to situate yourself not just as artist but as activist? You mentioned this tripartite understanding of the word act. I've always wondered, the romantic notion that we have of the artist is, I just had to do this because I felt it, but you've articulated something different. I had to do this for a reason that is political. So I'm wondering where that moment, if you can articulate or identify it, comes into play.
All right, so, I think she was directing us to, all right, yeah. You're right. It's not a question that really occurs to me in that way. It's too blocky. It's too rude. Doesn't fit. People, me, many artists, many of my friends have a different sense of their creative processes, and many of them are exactly that, processes. It's the living of life. It's the interactive nature of material, failing, going back there in the world, meeting someone else who was doing it in a slightly different way. The moment at which you politicize yourself or your practice or try to place it within that kind of narrative, I think is when you lose the rhythm, that sort of the tick-tock that's inside of you. What you're trying to do is you're trying to get that thing to really sort of have its own state of play. And I think if we try to pull back and have this sort of helicopter view of your practice, it's useful. All right? We have critics out there. We have other artists who can give us outside points of view on that. But I think at its best, what we should do is try to go back to, well, I think this romantic notion that you come up with is a good one. The romantic notion of the artist is one who's in the cave, and he's working on his magnum opus, his confession. And he emerges at some point with something, and that ta-da moment in today's time has very little to do with the cave. I think the cave is much more in here, and it has to be protected from the desire of the work to be seen in such rude points.
Can I just add that I think that in many ways this is where this relationship comes out, because I think when, you know, we go to the cave, the privileged ones who get to go to the cave, which is all of us, I think, you know, there's a way in which it then becomes this conversation between us that then thinks through how what you're doing there can be differently informed by a larger set of questions. And so that's, I think, the role of institutions at their best is to offer 17 different ways into your cave that come out of, is this the way in? Is that the way in?
No, I disagree. With the professionalization of the art industrial complex, all these artists are going through Yale. They're going through all the same arguments that many of our critics are having. This notion that the artists don't know what they're doing it needs. No. I'm not accusing you of this. I'm just saying that this exists in the culture.
Yes,
right?
Definitely.
And I think that what should happen is that, and I think what I'm going back to is that quiet space where no one should be allowed. And the cave, because the cave is not physical anymore. Mm-hmm. The cave is do whatever the hell it is that you feel like you need to be doing. If you need to go off into the jungles of Sri Lanka and learn how to study tsetse fly, God bless you. But in the end, that's something that should inform your work that has very little to do with received. And I think that's the thing where it goes back to Heisenberg and observation of particles, where the observation itself just sets it all up. And we want it to sort of continue its dance without being observed for, leave the cave alone for a second, and then let it go out there. And then I think that polaris, that back and forth between, is rather fruitful. Mm-hmm. But so it wasn't that.
Well, I'm a little bit lost, I'm sorry, because sometimes I don't understand him completely. But you were asking me why suddenly between art and activist, what is how can I change, and why did I change, no?
À quel moment, dans le processus de produire l'art, tu fais un champ fondamental?
Okay, well, at the moment, okay, at the moment I decide, well, I recognize who I am. When I was young, I told you before, then I suddenly recognized I was gay, and suddenly it changed completely my mind, because I'm from the bourgeoisie, I'm born in the center of Paris, I grew up in the best lyceum you can imagine, and so on, but suddenly something changed. And this door opened me to the real life, I will say. And because I decided to open doors, I never stopped. And I hope I will never stop opening doors. And before I will die, I will try to, as I spend some time with people who have disabilities, I spend some time with people that I didn't know were about 6 stations of subway from my house. This was very important for me, to embrace the world in my way.
think my quick answer to that, simply based on what Kehinde said, is that quite often my experience of artists, particularly in the late 20th century and now in the 21st century, is that the artist is not operating from this sense of being an activist, but the work they are making when it exists in the world, right? In community, in presentation, is activist, right? So that the cave is the protected space, and that's where the artist is, but when that work, right, particularly when that work comes from a space of incredible power and is deeply profound, it then lives in a super activist space. Question in the back, the man with the hat will start, so yes.
Okay, you spoke about the relevance of Baldwin and then of Frantz Fanon, these to French art and the role of race in it. But I'm wondering if you could speak on the relevance of Aimé Césaire and the French surrealists, Negritude, who were the real pioneers in the beginning, taking concepts from the visual arena of French surrealism and applying it in a literary context to bring forth the concept of a new version of blackness in a way that was profoundly, beautiful, really, but also profoundly political. Thank you.
I'll take that. Thank you for bringing that up. I think that, the thing that surrealism offers is one of the first European avant-gardes that already existed in its moment of inception as something that artists who were of African descent or not of European descent exclusively could make and remake in their own language. And if you think about somebody like Wilfredo Lamb as another figure, as well as Aimé Césaire, and his magazine that was able to, in the moment where Vichy comes to power, immediately think through the kind of conjoined figures of, on the one hand, the political, and on the other hand, the imagination and the psychic, I think offers the kind of room that I think we've been trying to carve out. So thank you for bringing those figures to the table. I think the other thing for Aimé Césaire, just to go back to the figure of the human, that I think in many ways humanism is both a gift and a curse of the French, and I think that Aimé Césaire, perhaps no more than any other theorist and thinker, pointed to that kind of double-sided way in which humanism could lead to atrocity, but also offer something different.
I'm going to go to this side over here first, and then I'm going to come back over this way. Yeah.
Hi, this is so inspirational. It's really great to hear everybody. My question is about, I guess in the past, the art world, the patrons were the state and the church. And today, the art world is so driven by the global elite and these people who, are finance people or who buy art as a tax shelter or an investment. And I guess I was just wondering, is it possible to create liberatory art in a world that's driven by people who benefit from colonialism and oppression? Or, how does that work? I'm always thinking about it.
Can I take that one?
Yes, definitely. Go for it. That was made for you. Go for it.
I think this is one of the biggest conflicts in the art world, the art market. You meet young artists who are hopeful and really profoundly trying to create utterances that go out into the world and will have some aspect. And then rich people want to buy their stuff. Is that a problem? Well, yes and no. This is, again, a system in which we have to put oxygen into the system. The artists have to eat. The artists have to be we live in one of the most expensive cities in the world. If we want our artists to not have day jobs and to go out there and to create, hell yeah, someone has to pay for that. And do I have a problem with that? Hell no. What I do have a problem with is where the consuming side of the art starts to dictate the direction in subtle ways and not so subtle ways of the production side of art. And so where you get the new aspect of the fair culture, where artists have to all of a sudden create new work for their galleries, who are these insatiable, because obviously the galleries have a new model. There's no brick and mortar anymore. It's Art Basel, it's Art Hong Kong, it's Art whatever, Art Dubai. that I think is slowly starting to tap away at some of the, and you know, this is what we as artists, we talk about on the real when it comes to, is money getting in the way of our ability to really be effective? The other thing I think is also perception. You mentioned the society of the spectacle and the notion of pushing the walls of what's expected within the art community. We're also used to the gloss and the appeal of the four white walls. We're so used to the call to arms that artists have in the early 21st century. I think that the gentleman who asked the question earlier about Aimé Césaire and the notion of a weaponized aesthetic that comes out of the 1960s and comes out of the 1950s and the independence movement is a very important one. It's not one that I can have at its core, because that moment is gone. But what's interesting about that moment is that it showed us that there's moments of real crucial consequence in which artists don't have the time, or at least artists said to their friends, "What are you doing making abstraction? We ain't got no time for that. We need you to create something that is a revolution at the level of sign. We need you to create something that goes out there," and the terms at the time had a certain masculinity to it, a type of bravado, the same stuff that we see in socialist realist sculpture, the same stuff that comes out of the Maoist years. That stuff is chest-beating art. That stuff is art of consequence. It's trite, it's kitsch, it's played out. But you are pointing, sir, to something it's dormant in us, and we all know, I think, somewhere in there that we can do better. We all know that somewhere in the culture, it's not about art and money. It's about art and weaponizing our aesthetics and giving our artists the challenge to really build the superstructure of that thing. Yeah.
Thank you, all the way from downstairs. So I came up to ask a question. Thank you. I had the opportunity to visit Paris in September for a writers' conference. And it was a special moment for me because I'm from New Orleans, and it has this, this iconography that is unique to me, and it's my first time there. And one thing that really, really just kind of gave me pause as I'm walking these pedestrian strips, I'm seeing these reliefs from this colonial period just kind of littered throughout Paris. And I wonder, well, when can we take these things to task, especially in New Orleans right now? We are facing this moment of saying we need to take down these statues of these slave owners. I don't understand why these reliefs are still present. And I just suppose that as a writer thinking about art, I'm in the Orsay Museum, and I'm on the same street where I saw one of these reliefs. I see a Monet that is capturing this really vivid Bastille Day celebration. So my question is, when does that happen in France? Will people start to take these things down and start to kind of say, this is not a really good representation of us, of Africans, of humanity?
Yeah, thank you for the question. One way to answer would be to say that you could think of another option than taking them down. That would be to render them visible, because you notice them, but a lot of people in Paris don't. They don't even notice that Paris was built out of slavery, out of colonialism, and French humanism is, part of we inherit also this French humanism from this history. So I would rather consider that there is an issue about reconnecting what is happening in Le Musée d'Orsay or other museums with what you can encounter on the streets, and especially encounter through human beings. I mean, these streets are being, inhabited by different races and different kind of people with very complex ethnicity. So the challenge that you're raising would be, rather than to say we don't want to see those things anymore on the buildings or on the streets, would be to make them visible and explain why they are there, which is something that so far is not being done at all in the French society. The history programs for students in public schools are very poor when it comes to having the tools to decipher this reality. And this is something that we still have to work on. And that would bring to art, inevitably. This would make people understand in a much richer, in a richer way what art is about in France also.
Yes, but also we can say that there was this palais of colonies who began the Museum of Immigration. Then in the same building where you can find the fresque from the colonies, suddenly this museum is dedicated to the immigrant, to immigration.
But I have an objection to this, I'm afraid. That would be that the story of the palace is not explained with relation to immigration. And the fact that the immigrations that are on display in this Cité Nationale de l'Histoire de l'Immigration are immigrations that were built also through slavery and through colonization. So you have this complete disconnection between the building and what's inside of it. And this is something that a lot of people have been arguing for a long time in France. I mean, me and others, we were trying to make the point that this building should not be reframed or recast as the Museum of Immigration, but there should be this continuity so that this is understood as also the place where colonization took place and war was on display for the French people. And this is something that is not being done so far. I mean, you have this kind of, this was the past and now is the present. No, this is not how it works. There is a colonial present in France that can also be actually viewed in the way there was this kind of shift of we are going to transform Le Palais des Colonies into La Cité Nationale de l'Immigration. And this is not how it works in people's minds and in people's stories and histories.
We have a question here. Get the mic. Thank you.
This question is actually for Mr. Willy. Knowing that the black artists in France is not giving the branche à la française, and if I'm informed correctly, your collection, your stained glasses collection, are really exhibit of Le Petit Palais, which is very rococo. And so, what's the representation? What's the race thing? Because it's quite fascinating, I suppose.
The exhibition at the question was, your work is at the Petit Palais. What's up with that? And I'm sorry, my work is about translating, right? So I am in love with painting. I'm in love with the history of it and the spectacle of it. But one of the really high points, high watermarks in painting is the depiction of light across flesh. You see it through Rubens, through Caravaggio. You see it in Vermeer. And what it does is it allows the people to look at something that's not a bowl of fruit, because we don't care as much about fruit as we do people, or landscapes, because there's a hierarchy in media. And within that hierarchy, the way that light draws itself across the human body has been a principle. Within the language of religious painting, the depiction of God has been the highest of all, and his depiction is Shem, has been through light. And so I actually in the Petit Palais have stained glass. And here we have the coming together of all of these pursuits. The story of the Christ child shot through the specter of black male bodies, both here in the American streets and in Africa, and also shot through literally colored light into the Petit Palais.
Thank you so much. My question is for Kehinde. I guess you're getting a lot of questions. I had seen your work displayed here in the States. I live in Brooklyn. And I realized it wasn't until I made it to Paris, to the Louvre, that I understand your work. And seeing the images of the great painters, because I'm a filmmaker, I went to film school, we're subjected to a slightly different canon, and I just wasn't as aware, and so it was standing underneath those images that I actually understood what you were doing in your work. And I wondered if you can speak to how Americans, Black Americans, receive those images, and also the people that you depict in them. How do they receive that work? How do they understand that work, especially if they are not exposed or haven't been, as I wasn't, to those images before?
It's a good question. I'll try to be brief. There's a difference between appreciating a gilded frame in the Louvre and appreciating it at the Met. It's a city full of gilded frames when you're in France. There's a different engagement with history. It's a natural weight that wears on your shoulder, whereas in the Met, you're putting on drag. There's got to be some place where this temporal shift that happens in my work happens not on the level of historical sign, whether it be signifying bling on a frame, or even the attitude of a landed gentleman. But I think it has to happen much on the level of the type of empathy dynamics. And it used to be like class dynamics in my head, but I think it's much more like empathy. Like, who are these people? What really gives you the right to show up on my museum walls? Why am I gonna pay my money to go see you? The visibility, the showing up aspect, I think for me is the bigger transformational act. I think less than the sort of how dare you step into this gilded frame, but rather how dare you be seen in the middle part of quotations. How dare you be on stage? And I think that's a question for writers and filmmakers as much as it is for painters. And I think it has to do with what Kerry James Marshall said to me years ago when he first visited my studio at Yale. And he saw my attempts to create paintings that had a type of empathy. And he was like, you're messing up. He was like, the edge is all off. There's the space where black skin meets the world. Boy, go look at some Rubens. Look at the way that skin meets the world. It's dithered. It's not a sharp cut. There's a moral statement being said in the way that you paint. The physical act of painting is something that's been morally coded historically. You saw it in France. We see it here, but it resonates differently with black and brown bodies inhabiting those spaces.
I think we have time for one more question. I see right here. Thank you.
Hi, good evening. Thank you so much for coming and talking and giving your viewpoint. I just wanted to know if anyone could just talk about maybe advertising. I know advertising in itself is an art form, and like Mr. Wiley, thank you so much for making someone like me look powerful and beautiful. But I feel so underrepresented in advertising, especially in a commercial space, and especially when people don't have access to contemporary art, and they get these viewpoints, you know, of me or someone who looks like me based on advertisements. So does anyone have an idea of how we can maybe put that into a more commercial space of representation?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know, does anyone else have an answer? I mean, what I would say quite specifically is that I think that quite often that art lives at an edge, right? And quite often the space of art creates ideas, both visual ideas that circulate in the world, but also concept and theory. I think it is easy to see the impact of Kehinde's work, right, in the space of the larger cultural conversation, right, and the way that has been translated positively and sometimes without the sort of nuance and power, of course, that he brings to his work. But I think to impact advertising, we're talking about impacting economies, and that's a very different conversation than the conversation that I think that we can have in the space of art, which is essentially a space of ideas. I hope that you all will join me in thanking Ms. Sarah Thomas, Kehinde,